One of the underlying concerns with everything we do, whether it's on a personal computer or one used for business, is making sure that our information is secure. This is important for a variety of reasons. Naturally, we tend to think of keeping the bad guys out first when it comes to security. On a personal computer, that usually means anyone who isn't us or a member of our immediate family or household, whether they're a neighbor or those who really want to steal our private information and use it for their own purposes. Concerns over those people, the bad guys, extends to the business world as well. But in addition, we often need to secure information, not because anyone necessarily wants to do anything with it, or at least anything harmful with it, but because it should be private. Personnel information comes under that category, as would client information and sales and financial records. Depending on your business, it might even include things like research and development, things that just aren't ready to be released yet, or even marketing plans. This series addresses users of SharePoint. In this capacity, it's really not necessary for you to completely understand all the mechanics of creating, configuring, and assigning permissions. We do that in the administrator classes. But, as is always my philosophy, as a user who has permissions applied to you and to the content you will want to access and use, it is important that you understand the basics of how security works. It can be important so that you can know why you can or can't see certain options or content. It can be important to help you know where to turn to should you run into specific types of issues. In this particular video, I want to review in a non-technical way how permissions work in SharePoint. That includes what's secured, how it's secured, and where you can review permissions. Why do you need to know about security, though? That's a question a lot of people want to know, because many times users of computer systems just don't bother themselves with security issues. After all, that's for IT and the people who do that for a living. You need to understand, though, where you can go and what you can do with content in all of the locations that you happen to use. If you can't access content or do something you want, it helps to understand the possible reasons why. Understanding why allows you to decide if the issue is something that is supposed to be happening or not. In either case, you can then determine who to speak with to change it. In other words, if it's working correctly because you don't have permissions, maybe you need to speak to an administrator so they can give you permissions. If it's something that you should have access because you do have permissions, then you need to try to look for some other reason. You also need to be sure that you're properly securing information on your network. This really is your fiduciary duty. As a user of information, of business information, you owe it to your company and your colleagues, and possibly even your clients and maybe even the public in general, to keep information private and secure that should be. By the way, don't forget, as the owner of a My Site, you are responsible for permissions. It's your site, you are the administrator, and you control all of the permissions in that particular site. I always like to focus on what you're already familiar with. What do you already know? Because you're comfortable with that, and then you have a frame of reference in which you can put the new things that you're about to learn. What you already know is that on a computer, sometimes you are unable to open certain files. And sometimes you can open a file, but you can't save any changes to it. Everybody's experienced that. This is due to permissions. Now, people use different terminology for it, but it all comes down to permissions or security. Permissions can be placed on files, folders, drives, entire computers or devices like scanners and printers, and even entire locations or domains on networks. Really, a lot of different levels can have security. Think about what you do at work. Now, of course, I don't know exactly what you do at work, but you've probably heard stories, or maybe even it's been yourself, where you try to log on to the network, but you can't get to the M drive. Maybe only people in HR can get to the M drive. Or maybe you can get into a particular project folder, but other people cannot. These are the types of restrictions that we're referring to. We generally think of 3 levels of permissions that you do have. One would be that you don't have any access. You can't open it even if you wanted to. Then you can have read-only access. This is often used for things that you should be able to review but not modify. Or you might have full control, where you can open, you can edit, you can change, you can do a save as, pretty much anything you want to do with the file. Now, yes, I know that technically we can have more levels than this, but these are the 3 basic ones that we think about on the standard network. The last thing to consider is that you got the access you have probably when you were hired. Now, again, we won't get into all of the intricacies of how that may have changed over time. But when you were hired, or shortly thereafter, you needed computer access. So somebody had to create a computer account or a username and a password, and they also assigned permissions to you. But when you were given computer access, you probably didn't have an all-access pass. In other words, unless you worked for a very small company, you probably couldn't get into every file, every folder, every directory, and every drive that you wanted to. At your workplace, you most likely don't have access to everything. That's just not something that normally happens. Why not? Because when your profile was created, we have to think about how that happened. Again, in a small company, or certainly in your home, it's possible that you were just given a logon and you did have access to everything. But generally, do you think when your profile was created that somebody in IT got the request, they sat down, created a username and a password, and then went through every single file, folder, drive, computer, printer, scanner, and every other resource one by one and ticked off a list and said, yep, they should be able to access that. Nope, they shouldn't be able to access that. Well, they can read this one, but they can have all permissions on this one? Absolutely not. Even in the smallest company, that would take forever for one person, much less for 10 or 100 or 1,000, or what about 90,000 employees? So that's simply not what occurs. Instead, what happened was you were given a profile, a username and a password, but then you as an individual were assigned to one or more groups. These groups could have been based on your job title, your department, your location, your level, a variety of different things. For example, if you were hired as an admin, you could be put into the admins group. If you worked in HR or IT, you could be put into those groups. Maybe you were added to the Los Angeles or the Dallas or the New York or the Philadelphia groups. And by level, I mean you could be a C-level employee, so maybe you were given manager's permissions or executive level permissions. You were probably assigned not just to one, but to many different groups based on your job role. And of course, those could change over the years. The important thing to remember is you weren't given individual permissions one by one. You were assigned to a group. The groups have permissions assigned to them. So when you get assigned to the admins group or the IT group, that group already has permissions telling the computer system what you should and should not have access to and at what level. You, therefore, are inheriting the permissions of the group or the groups that you're part of. That way, when you're hired, they may add you to 5 different groups as opposed to going through 50,000 different resources. It's the only way this can take place, and it's the only way it happens, and it happens over and over again, probably hundreds of thousands of times around the world. Now, how does all of this relate to SharePoint? Well, permissions in SharePoint are exactly the same as they are on the network. We like that about SharePoint. It utilizes so many things that we're already familiar with. SharePoint will actually leverage part of the network that's already in place. At least it's usually already in place. Remember that SharePoint usually runs on a system that's running a Windows server and an Exchange server, and because of that, it already has Windows servers with user accounts. User accounts may also be grouped, like we've been talking about, into things called domain groups or Active Directory groups. We don't have to worry about exactly what that is. Just know that those are things that the servers and the network administrators use. SharePoint can use those exact same accounts and those exact same groups for membership and permissions on SharePoint. That way we don't have to repeat anything. When someone is hired and they're added to the admins group and the Dallas group, they automatically get filtered into the SharePoint groups that utilize those same names. The permissions that go along with them automatically flow, and it makes it very easy. We can either add those groups, the Active Directory groups and domain groups, or technically we can add individuals to SharePoint groups. It's always better to add a group than it is to start working with individuals. When you work with individuals, you're micromanaging, and that's not what we want to do. Just like on the network, SharePoint groups have permissions applied to them. Members of the group then inherit whatever permissions the group has in SharePoint. So what about permissions in SharePoint? Let's get into the details in part 2 of this video.